face. And the crazy part about crucifixion is that it actually causes your chest and diaphragm to be in a constant state of inhale. So in order to exhale, you have to push up with your foot, which is on a nail. And so you can breathe out, take a breath in, and so as a result, I'm trying to do that as little as possible because his back would have been going up and down on the rough wood. And so as a result of that, that would have led to respiratory acidosis, where the excess carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, increasing the acidity of the blood and causing an irregular, erratic, and heartbeat. And coupled with the shock from the flogging, it led to a buildup of fluid, which would have not happened if he had survived and escaped. And it's interesting to note that in John chapter 19, and as in the hymn that we just sung, it records when the Roman soldier thrusts the spear into the side of Jesus to check to see if he is dead, that what appears to be water and blood come out. And that is a clear indication that he was indeed dealing with a pericardial effusion and pleural effusion when fluid rushes to the lungs and heart. The spear alone, yet again, with being that far, just a few inches off of the ground, these Romans were very tough, they were very good at what they did, and he would not have missed. He definitely went through a lung and a heart, possibly both. That alone would have killed him. The crucifixion alone would have killed him. The flogging alone, had he not sought immediate attention, would have killed him. So there was no way that he was going to escape that. And yet, when the Romans broke the legs of the other two thieves, Jesus was already gone. And that fulfilled another prophecy, that his bones would not be broken. And so even in these little things that were completely outside of Jesus' control, he was showing by what happened that he was who he said he was, and he kept his promises in these prophecies. And in light of that horror and just gruesomeness, I want to go back to the Garden of Gethsemane, a common thing that skeptics will say, well, it says there that he sweat drops of blood, and that's medically not possible. That's ridiculous. And yet, the actual term for it is hematidrosis. It's where extreme psychological stress causes a chemical release in the blood that can break the walls of capillaries in the sweat glands. It wouldn't have been much, it would have been very small amounts, but it would have appeared, there would have been, and it was, blood coming out. And if you look at what we just talked about, the horror and gruesomeness of that, and as someone who was fully God and fully man, that fully man part, that humanness, knowing what was happening, every ounce of pain that he was about to experience, to me that feels a little bit like extreme psychological stress. And yet this is so important. He walked into Jerusalem in broad daylight and challenged the chief priests and scribes, knowing what was coming, what they wanted to do to him. He did it willingly and boldly and fearlessly. It's so powerful. So, all of that to say, and that's the clean version. I appreciate you not running out. That is the proof that there's no way that he would have survived and did not survive. The second myth that we hear quite a bit is that the disciples just stole the body and then lied about it. And this is common, this is the theme in the Jewish nation today. Their repudiation of Jesus goes back to when the chief priests bribed the Roman soldiers to say that the disciples came to steal his body. Now, for me, looking at the account, and even just what we read here, where the disciples are confused, forgetful, and not quite grasping what's going on, it doesn't really sound like something that they would do. They had just witnessed what I just described to you, and knew that if they were caught, if they were a lot more difficult. There was no cement projects back in those days to just make a body disappear. A bunch of guys running around in the dark trying to lug a heavy object would have been seen very easily. But more than that, it's important to know that the fact that Jesus was even buried was a really big deal. Everyone knew that people who were crucified were not buried, which was part of the whole message that Rome was trying to send. And it's also something that was important to know, that Jesus would have experienced what a crucifixion was throughout his entire life living under the Roman rule. The bodies were left on the cross for days or weeks, and eventually a slave would be sent out to take whatever was left and take it down to the dump. It was meant to be a message for a long period of time. And yet, a Pharisee and a very rich person who didn't want, neither of these people wanted anyone to know that they were followers of Jesus, went to Pilate and actually bribed him to take the body of Jesus and bury him. So even the fact that he was buried was a really big deal. And yet, in that story, we see that the disciples weren't there for that. They had run away. The moment Jesus died, he had no more followers. He had been saying, "I'm the resurrection and the life." And now all of a sudden he's gone. He's dead. He said all of these things, he made all these promises, and until he returned from the dead, they were lies. So they weren't even at the funeral. And they all ran away and they were in hiding. One of the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, one of the temple guards tried to grab him, and he twisted out of his cloak and sprinted through the woods naked, because he wanted to be away as quickly as possible. And Peter denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times, including to a middle school girl around a warming fire. These were not courageous, tough, or brave individuals. Which leads us back to the accounts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, James, and John. The disciples are very lifelike in all of these portrayals, all of these accounts. They had time. These were written 20 to 30 years after the events. And as we've all known people from fishing expeditions, where as the years go by, the fish get bigger, they would have had time to spin this story if it wasn't true. There's in none of these accounts is there a recording of, and all 12 of us, we knew that he was coming back. So we were outside of the tomb Sunday morning going 10, 9, 8, 7. They didn't do it because they weren't there. And as a quick aside, it's important to know that I personally don't believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead simply because the Bible says so. And the reason is that there were thousands and thousands of Christians before there was a Bible. These accounts, eyewitness accounts, were written down by people who were there, or in Luke's case, he investigated people who were there and got their accounts and recorded them. So it's important to know that before there was even a Bible, if you have someone that says, "Well, I don't believe the Bible," say, "Well, good, let's talk about history then." Because before the Bible existed, there were thousands of Christians who did believe Jesus died and rose again. The next point is that in first century Judea, when Mary Magdalene and the other women were the first to see the tomb empty and to record that he was not there, and then Mary to see him, she was the first one to see him alive again. That's a really big deal because in those days, women were not allowed to give testimony in court. So the word of these women would not have been taken seriously unless it was actually real. The disciples would have reported that they were the ones there first, that they were the ones who saw Jesus alive first. And as such, would have totally changed how that story went. And after the resurrection, after they've seen Jesus, they all march back into Jerusalem just a few days later and are talking about the resurrection. They had seen clearly what the Romans and the Jewish temple people did to Jesus. They knew that that fate awaited them, unless it was actually true and Jesus was alive again. He was who he said he was. And so by that power and by that amazing thing that they had seen with their own eyes, they walked back into Jerusalem and saw the people who were there at Jesus' trial and execution, and they walked up to them and they said, "You killed him, but God raised him from the dead. We've seen him with our own eyes. Say you're sorry." And they said this over and over and over again in their account.